Bez Hashem, today's daf is Masechta Horayos Daf Zayin. And guess what? We're going to be making a Siyama Masechta at the end of the week. So hang in there. We're discussing very simply that, and this is a very important point. That is that the Kohen Gadol is different than a regular Jew. A regular Jew that does an Avera by mistake, let's say he's Mechal Shabbos, brings a female goat or female sheep as a carbon chatas. The Kohen Gadol, if he makes a mistake, doesn't have to bring anything. He does not have to bring any carbon chatas. The only time the Chumash says that a carbon chatas is brought by a Kohen Gadol, so let's just go here. The Torah tells us in Parshas Vayikra, Dabel b'nei Yisrael, nefesh kisechta b'shkal mikol mitzvah s'shem shlo yisana v'yisem mechachas mehena. If you make a mistake, even part of a mistake, you have to bring a carbon chatas. Im hakoyin hamashiach yachta. If the kohen gadol makes the sin, for example, he carried on Shabbos, la'ashma sa'am, it has to be the way Gans Klal Yisrael will bring a carbon chatas. When Gans Klal Yisrael brings one carbon chatas, it's called Par Herlim Davar Shel Tzibur, where the 71 Sanhedrin paskined first, and then Gans Klal Yisrael followed that Avera, followed that wrong psak. So the Kohen Gadol, in order for him to bring a carbon chatas of a cow, would have to make a hayra. Writes a shilas and chuvas. He says you can carry on Shabbos, and then he himself carries on Shabbos. Only then you bring a par ben bakar tamin lashem lechatas. So he has to have what's called a hayri. A pardon me. He has to make a hayra. Okay, so now let's begin. Okay, hi Lewis. We just began on the second parak of Masechta Horayos. Okay, so let's go. The Mishnah says that Hoira, very important, the Kohen Gadol makes a psak. Let's say he said, you're allowed to eat blood, okay? La'atzmai, for himself. Shoigig, and it was a mistaken psak. V'also shoigig, and then he did this by accident. He thinks his psak is good, and then and what does he do? He eats blood. So maybe par, then he brings that cow. Shoigig v'asa mezid. Let's say he made a mistaken psak, and then anyway, when he ate,
No.
when he ate the blood, he was doing it anyway on purpose. Mezid v'asa shoigig, or he knew he was doing wrong by making this bad psak, but when he did the avera, he forgot what his psak was, or maybe he thought he made a good psak. So in that case, it's pata. Shahiroas kohen Mashiach la'atzmai kairoas bezdin la'atzmai. That's the important point over here. Is the kohen gadol? He brings the carbon chatas in the same manner that Gans Klal Yisrael would bring one carbon chatas, and that means that the Gans Klal Yisrael brings the carbon chatas only if the bezdin made a psak, and then the Gans Klal Yisrael followed after that psak. So the kohen gadol will never bring a normal carbon chatas. He has to have a hoira and a shigas maisa. Remember that. Hoira means he has to paskin for himself that you're allowed to do something. For example, eat blood, and to do that action on his own by mistake. Says the Gemara, shoygig v'asa shoygig maybe par pshita. Of course, isn't that what the Chumash says? That if he's like Bezdin, he has to do it all by mistake. He has to make a mistaken psak and also follow along based on that mistaken psak and do the avera. Amar Abaya hachabamayaskinin. And here we're talking about the Mishnah is teaching you a chiddush. Kegoin shahira. He made a fake psak or a mistaken psak, I should say. He made a mistaken psak. V'shachach me'ezetam hari. He forgot when he did the avera. What was the reason why he paskin this way? In other words, why did he paskin that it's permitted to eat blood? When he actually ate the blood, Oimar, he said, I know I made a psak that you're allowed to eat blood, but I'm not sure why. So here, the same I would have thought, came in the Ilimisyadale. Maybe if he would have rethought his psak, Shamahodabe, maybe he would have had charata and not eat the blood. So kameza dummy, let's consider him like he did it on purpose, and he should not bring a par. Veloy l'chayv, he shouldn't be obligated to bring a par. Kamash malon. That's what the Mishnah teaches you. Mezid v'asa shaygig, if he made a mistake and he did it on purpose, he's purposely said you're allowed to, he wrote a psak, you're allowed to eat blood, and then by mistake he ate the blood. Mino halin bili, how do we know that a kohen gadol needs a hayra'ah? Okay, remember, a kohen gadol will not bring his own carbon chatas on a mistake. He has to paskin first, and then do the mistake, because because the Torah tells you by a carbon ash im a kohen Mashiach yachta, as you see it on the screen, la'ash masa'am. It's similar to the way Gans Klal Yisrael did an avera. And he brings a carbon for his avera. So what do we see from here? Harei Mashiach Ketzibur. The Mashiach is like the Tzibur. The Tzibur had a Hayra'ah from the Bezdin, and then they did the Avera. So the Mishkarim Mikadol had to have a Hayra'ah and then do the Avera. Now, I wouldn't need any pasuk to teach me that. But I would have thought about this idea myself. We go to Zayin Amar Aleph. Tziva Mutzim Miklal Yochid, Mashiach Mutzim Miklal Yochid. The carbon Tzibar of a Paralel Dav Mashiva is different than a regular carbon Chatas, and the Kohen Gadol's carbon Chatas is different from a regular carbon Chatas. Mat Tzibar, just like, so the Mashiach should be like the Tzibar. Mat Tzibar Ein Chayav Ela Helam Dava Mishigigas Maisa. Just like Alf Mashiach Lo Yechayev Ela Helam Dava Im Shigigas Masa. That they're just like the Tzibor had to have a mistaken psak, and then they did the Avera. So also the Mishkarim Kadol has to have a mistaken psak and then did the Avera. So that's clear. Wait a second. We could say that the Mishkarim Kadol is like if the king did an Avera. The Torah tells you that when a king does an Avera, he doesn't bring a female animal, a female goat. He brings a male goat, right? And if you want to see the psukim are right here. Asher. Here the pasuk says, "Asher nose yachta." If the king makes a mistake, the habeas carbonoi seir izim a male goat as a carbon chatas, whereas a regular Jew brings a female goat. So wait a second, nasi miklal yochid. A king is different than every individual. A Mashiach mutzim miklal yochid, and the kohen gadol is different than every individual because he brings a cow. Ma nasi, just like a king, maybe v'shigus masa b'loy helam dava. Af Mashiach maybe v'shigus masa b'loy helam dava. Just like a king, he brings a kar mechatas even by just making the mistake without even paskening beforehand. So the kohen gadol also will say that he brings a carbon par even if he didn't make a mistake. So now you have two choices. You can compare the kohen gadol to the tzibor. You can compare the kohen gadol to the king. So the Gemara says, what is a kohen gadol more similar? Tzibor bepar ve'ein mevi'en asham toli. A tzibor is with a carbon par, which brings a cow, and a tzibor doesn't bring an asham toli. There's no such a thing of a mistaken asham toli by a tzibor. Or the Mashiach also bepar, when he makes a mistake, he brings a cow. Ve'ein mevi'en asham toli, and he doesn't bring an asham toli. So then we'll make a mistake. So the tzibur, the kohen gadol is very similar to the tzibur in the animal, right? So we'll say mat tzibur ein echayv ela helam dava im shigas ma'isa. Mashiach leichayv ela helam dava im shigas ma'isa. So we see that the kohen gadol is very similar to the tzibur in the fact that it brings the similar animal, plus it doesn't bring an asham toli. So therefore, we'll say that the Mashiach, the kohen gadol, will also need a psak first before him doing the erroneous action in order to bring a carbon. Oi, klach derzu. The Gemara goes back. Maybe you can say kohen gadol is like a king, because nasi mevis ira b'avodah zarah. When nasi, a king makes a mistake in avodah zarah, he brings a carbon sa'ir, like a female, a regular goat, umevi ashim vadai. And it is possible for a kohen gadol, for a king, to bring a carbon asham. A carbon asham is by specific averas that you may do on purpose, and here, like an asham mi'ila or asham gazelis, all sorts of these type of unique carbonos are only brought by an individual. So a king brings that, Mashiach also maybe seer by avodah zara. The Torah tells you when he does a chet in avodah zara, he brings a seira, and maybe ashim badi, and he brings an ashim badi. So the king is very similar to the Kohen Gadol is very similar to the king, right? The Kohen Gadol is very similar to the king. So I'll say, Ma Nasi, just like a king, maybe B'Shgigas Maisa, Af Mashiach, maybe B'Shgigas Maisa. So I'll say that just like a king brings without a Hayrah before, so also a Kohen Gadol will bring a Karban Chatas without paskening first. So the question that the Gemara's bottom line question here is what? How do you read this pasuk? The pasuk says that if the Kohen Gadol makes a mistake, he brings a par. We're trying to tell you that in order for him to bring this cow, he had to paskin first that he was allowed to do this avera. He wrote a tshuva that he was allowed to do this avera and then did it. How do you know that? So the Gemara says, the Torah says that when a Kohen Gadol does a mistake, it's similar to when Gans Klal Yisrael did a mistake. Just like the carbon, the tzibor that brings one par is only if they had a psak from Bezdin, and then they did it the Avera. So same thing by a Kohen Gadol, he has to make a psak first and then did the mistake. Now the Gemara asks a question. Eimer, let us say, Gemara asks an interesting question. If the Kohen Gadol is like the tzibor, that just like by Bezdin makes the psak, and Gans Klal Yisrael does the avera. So let's say a Kohen Gadol, the only time he'll bring a par is if he makes the psak and Klal Yisrael did the avera. How do you know that if he himself did the avera after his own psak, he brings that cow? Talmud Bavli, the pasuk says, "V'hikriv al chatasoi ashachata." The cow is brought on his own avera. Who maybe he doesn't bring a cow because of the sins of Klal Yisrael. He brings the cow only because he made that sin. Albeit he had to paskin first that he's allowed to do the avera, and then did the avera by mistake. Amar Mar Mashiach Bapar ve'eini meiva ashen tali. B'nolei de'eini meiva ashen tali. How do we know that a Kohen Gadol does not bring an ashen tali? The Ksiv by an ashen tali it says v'chipur all about koyim al shigigosay al sheshaga mi shechatosay v'shigigosay shava. The Gemara says that by an ashen tali it says that only a regular Jew who when he does an avera brings right away a carbon chatas doesn't need a psak before. His shoygig and his avera is one of the same. But by a regular Kohen Gadol, since it's a two-step process, first he has to make a psak, and then he has to do the avera. So then that person is exempt from an asham toli. Yatsa Mashiach she'ein shigigasav v'chadash shava. The ksiv, the pasuk says la'ashma sa'am. Harei Mashiach ketziba. The Mashiach is like a tzibah, but that it's a two-step process. First he has to paskin, and then he has to follow through. So now the Gemara says, but the Gemara in the Brisa said, even before the Ashmas Ha'am, the Gemara said before that a Mashiach before that the Kohen Gadol is like the tzibur that he brings a cow and doesn't bring an Asham Tali. And the Brisa said this before, knowing the pasuk of La'ashmas Ha'am, that he needs a Hayrah before. Ela Asham Kedinas, but the Gemara didn't mean that. And the Gemara just meant, the Brisa meant that the Kohen Gadol is similar to a tzibur because they're both bringing cows. That's it. Next Mishnah. Hayra bifnei atzmai. Let's say the king, the Kohen Gadol, we're talking about a Kohen Gadol. He made a psak that you're allowed to do avodah zara, v'asa bifnei atzmai, and he said that you're allowed to, and he did the avodah zara. Then he brings his own carbon, right? Hayra im hatzibar v'asim hatzibar. Let's say he paskin the same thing that the Sanhedrin paskin. Sanhedrin said you're allowed to eat blood, and he also said you're allowed to eat blood. And he did it with the tzibur, then he doesn't bring his own carbon. He is yoitze, his obligation to bring a carbon with the power helam dova that's being brought on behalf of the tzibur. He doesn't have to bring a separate cow. This she'ein means ve'ein bezdin chayavan she'or levatel mitzvahs v'kayim mitzvahs v'chein Mashiach. The idea of a Sanhedrin is only if they try to uproot part of a mitzvah, not if they uproot a whole mitzvah. They say there is Shabbos, but you're allowed to carry on Shabbos. That's the example. And same thing by a Kari Mashiach. And same thing by Avodah Zarah. It means when Bezdin uproots Avodah Zarah, they say, oh, there's no Avodah Zarah in the world, then there's no parahel in Davar Tzibur. What they can say is that there is Avodah Zarah, but you're allowed to bow to an Avodah Zarah, even if it's not Avodah Bekach. So it means that they're keeping the mitzvah and trying to nullify part of the mitzvah. Only then is the obligation to bring a parahel in Davar Tzibur. Says the Gemara. Immediately, how do you know the following case that the Mashiach can be Yotzei with the Tzibur's par? The Tanar Rabbanan. Hoiri imet tzibur v'asim et tzibur. Let's say both the Kohen Gadol and the Tzibur paskin the same halacha. You're allowed to eat blood. Yachal yavei par la'atzmai. I would think the Kohen Gadol still has to bring his own kohen, his own carbon. V'dinu, that would make sense. Nasi butzim meklal yachid, Mashiach butzim meklal yachid. The king brings a separate carbon chatas, and Mashiach brings a separate carbon chatas. Ma nasi chata b'fnei atzmai, maybe b'fnei atzmai, chata mitzibim schapa le mitzibar, af Mashiach chata b'fnei atzmai, b'fnei atzmai, chata mitzibim schapa le mitzibar. That just like a king, although he has a different type of carbon chatas than every individual, but if he followed the Bezdin and the Gans Klal Yisrael did the same Aveira, the king doesn't bring his own carbon. He's mischaper yematzibar. So Kohen Gadol will say the same thing. Although if he did his own Aveira, he gets one carbon, but if he did it with the rest of Klal Yisrael, they bring one cow for the rest of Klal Yisrael. Or, loy, I would say that a Kohen Gadol needs to always bring his own carbon, because you see that on Yom Kippur. Loy Marta benasi by a king, Shem came mischaper le mitzibu Yom Kippurim. The king gets a kapara with the same so'ir, the same goat that you find on Yom Kippur. It's v'chapa on Klal Yisrael, it's v'chapa on the king. Time of Mashiach, but the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur brings his own carbon. He brings his own cow. She'emis chapa leim etzibu Yom Kippurim. And so therefore, hoyave emis chapa leim etzibu Yom Kippurim, yavi yochal yavi parla atzmai. I would think that the Kohen Gadol has to bring his own cow. Even if Gans Klal Yisrael did the same avera because of Bezdin, and the Kohen Gadol did it, I would think that the Kohen Gadol has to bring his own carbon. Talmud loy mashachata soy ashachata. Hoketzad. He brings the par only if he was the only one that did the aveira. That's what the pasuk said. Chata b'fnei atzmai, maybe b'fnei atzmai. If he did the aveira by himself, then he brings a par. Chata mematzibar. But if he did it with the tzibar, mischaper loy imatzibar. So if he did it with the tzibar, then he gets the kapar with the tzibar. Says the Gemara, hey chidami, what's the case? In other words, how is it that the Kohen Gadol could paskin and the Bezdin could paskin? I thought there's only one person that could paskin. There's one head. If the Kohen Gadol was the only one that could paskin, and the Sanhedrin were not, were not ro'i, not that they did not deserve to paskin. Pshita mischap b'fnei atzmei. Harod lehem klum uboy latu ekizbay sira kol chad b'chad. If the Bezdin is not a worthy Bezdin, then the psak is not even a psak, and every individual had to bring their own carbon. So of course the Kohen Gadol has to bring his own carbon. And are you going to say the reverse? Are you going to say that the Bezdin Sanhedrin was worthy of paskening, and the Kohen Gadol was not somebody that could paskin? Why should he need his own kapara? He shouldn't have been paskening in the first place. In other words, in order for a Kohen Gadol to bring a carbon chatas, he has to be somebody who's so learned that he could paskin for himself. So how are we going to have a case with the tzibur paskin and the Kohen paskin? We go to Amid Beis, Amar Al Papa Kagoyin Shayim Muflin Shteim. They're both. The Sanhedrin were worthy of paskening, and also the Kohen Gadol was somebody who was worthy of paskening. Sova Abai thought to say, what's this means? That he did a separate Aveira than the Tzibor. They were sitting in two different places, and they were talking about, let's say, the Kohen Gadol said you're allowed to do Avodah Zarah, and the Tzibor and the Sanhedrin said you're allowed to eat blood. So that's how each one will bring their own carbon. The tzibur brings it, and the kohen gadol brings it because they were talking about two different isura. Amalei Rava, so Rava said to Abaya, you don't need them to be sitting in two places. Atushneim and garment, el afil yasmu chad mokin, even if they're sitting in the same place, even if they're sitting in the base of Migdash. The cave of the komoyer betray Yisura chata b'fnei atzmehu. Since they're talking about two different things, the Sanhedrin were paskening that blood is mutter. The Kohen Gadol sitting in the base of Migdash pasking that part of Avodah Zarah is mutter. So and they all did the Avera, so then the Kohen Gadol will bring his own carbon because he didn't rely on Bezdin Psak. He made his own Psak in a totally different topic. So the Gemara says like this, Pshita, this would be very simple. This would be very simple. Hu bechelev v'hein ba'avodah zara. If the Kohen Gadol, it was paskening in chelev, and fats, you're allowed to eat non-kosher fats. And the Sanhedrin said you're allowed to do part of avodah zara. Chata b'fnei atzmehu v'hachalukim b'tamei v'chalukim b'kabaris. That's for sure two different things, different mitzvahs and different karbonas. One brings a par, and when a bezdin makes a mistake in avodah zara. By the way, when Bezdin makes a mistake in Avodah Zarah, there are psukim in the Chumash that say, here we go, the Eine Ha'eda Nesesa L'Shgaga, then they bring a par for a oila and a se'iz and lechatas. Normally, when Bezdin makes a mistake, as you can see on the screen, they bring one par. But if it had to do with kol mitzvahs, which is Avodah Zarah, and they made a mistake with regarding avodah zarah, they bring a par and an oila, powerful oila and a seizim lechatos. Fine. So, no problem. The kolshkein hu b'avodah zarah v'hein b'chelev, the chalukim become the saying, the hu se'ira v'inu par. So, certainly, if he paskin avodah zarah's mutter, and the bezin were talking about chelev, they bring separate carbonas. That's obvious. But what about this case? And what the Gemara is trying to say, can the Kohen Gadol be yotzei with the tzibor's carbon? For example, hu b'chelev, hamachasas aker, v'heim b'chelev shaladakim. Each one was mater chelev, but a different type of chelev. One was giving permission to eat the fats that it's covering the intestines, and one was giving the fats that cover the stomach. Mahu. Is that considered two different things? And they have to bring two different karbanos, the Kohen Gadol and the Sanhedrin, because it's two different psukim. So they're arguing in the reasons. Oidilma, but since you can look at it this way, Shem Chelev Echadhu, they're talking about fats. So maybe they have to bring one carbon. Imtim Saloim Shem Chelev Echad, Hu B'Chelev Behem Badam. Let's say he talked about fats and they talked about blood. Mahu, mi amrim b'tamayich hapligim, that they're totally different mitzvahs. One is fats and one is blood. Dilma kivin the shavim bekarban basa carbon aslinim. But at the end of the day, if someone eats fats by mistake, or he eats blood by mistake, you bring one carbon chatas, right? You bring the same carbon, so they're similar. So I would think that even if he paskin was talking about blood, and he was talking about fats, and they were talking about blood. If he did that Avera, he could be Yoitze his Chatas with the Par Helam Davashot Sibor, Teku, the Gemara leaves that under resolve. The aim of Bezdin Chayachim Vata Mitzvahs Chayim Mitzvahs, like we said this many times before, that it's not that the Bezdin says, oh, there is no Shabbos. They are saying there is Shabbos, but you're allowed to carry on Shabbos. Menolam, Dach Yor Levata Mitzvahs, the Chayim Mitzvahs, how do you know? That the Tami Garbina be the Pirkim, because we said in last parak, Benelam Dovar, Bezdin forgot. Made davar, you put the mem by the davar. They forgot part of a mitzvah. Like kol guf, not that they ignored the whole mitzvah. V'chein HaMashiach menolam. How do you know that? The pasuk says the Ash Masram HaMashiach Kitzima. The Kohen Mashiach has to, in order for him to bring the chatas, he had to do something similar like the tzibur, saying that I know there's Shabbos, but I'm paskening you a lot of carry on Shabbos, and he carried on Shabbos. V'loy be'avodah zarah menolam. How do you know that? The Torah Rabbanan. The fish yatsa avodah zarah ladim imnatza yochel yechaim al kiyus mitzvah kula. Avodah zarah, if you do it by mistake, the Torah tells you that they bring a different type of carbon, a seir, right? Not a seira, not a female, but a male. So, right, here's the psukim. The pasuk says, A's, he brings a female goat. If he brings a female cow, goat, he brings a goat, not a sheep, not a goat. He brings an A's. So now the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says, so I would think that avodah zarah is totally different than a regular korban chatas. So I would think that in order to be chayev, they have to that it would be okay if they uprooted the entire mitzvah. By, and here we'll stop. By the when the Torah in Parshas Shalach talks about if Bezdin said you're allowed to do avodah zarah, the Torah tells us vim eine ha'eda, if the 71 made a mistake and they told you the also kol ha'eda and all the entire Klal Yisrael did part of an avodah zarah. So it says me'ene over here, and it says me'ene by par helam davar shatzibar, just like by me'ene in Parshas Vayikra means that Bezdin paskin, not that they uprooted the entire mitzvah, but they kept the mitzvah, but they said part of the mitzvah you don't have to do. So also with it, avodah zarah, when they uproot it, they don't say that avodah zarah is permitted, but they say that avodah zarah is usher, but you're allowed to bow to an avodah zarah. It's part of the mitzvah, and only then they bring this unique korban, which is a par ben bakar. First they bring an oila, and then a sir izim, a goat for a chatos. Okay, we'll stop over here by this Mishnah.
Baruch, thank you. Thank you, Baruch. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.